Welcome, I'm Jeremy, Director of the Honors Program here at the School of Visual Arts, and I want to welcome everybody to this evening's Art and Politics Lecture Series. The Art and Politics Lecture Series exists because of the urgent crises facing humanity in the present moment. It seems each year, there are some things where you hope that you start a thing and then it becomes irrelevant because it's all about how sort of dark and troublesome things are, and only unfortunately becomes more relevant year by year. The lecture series, since its inauguration, has existed to think about the contemporary crises human beings are facing in the climate, in the economy, in rising authoritarianism, and more, and the relationship, the ties of contemporary art to our moment, the delicate filaments that tie together art and politics. Welcome to this evening's program. Before I introduce our speaker, just a couple of housekeeping things. I'm going to send around a sign-up sheet or a sign-in sheet. Please let us know you're here, especially if you're a student. I can send that around with a pen. And you can also, through the sign-up sheet, get updates about our lectures to come. We have an exciting series, including, among other things, Francis Fox Piven speaking on the one-year anniversary of Trump's inauguration in January. We have Emmy O'Brien, a psychoanalyst, speaking about sort of trans kids' childhoods and fantasy lives. We have a Luigi Ballerini speaking about what food is being served at the Last Supper. It turns out, among other things, it's eels. And he'll have some things to say about that in November. And very likely, there's still yet to be totally confirmed former Congressman Jamal Bowman in February. So a lot of things coming up this year. There's also at the front of the room, which you can grab on your way out, a flyer with the programming for the year. So please feel free to pick up one of these on your way out. The other thing for the students in the room is I promised for our apple picking trip on October 12th, the sign-up sheet. So I'm going to send this around too. Please just make sure I get this back at the end of the day, so make sure it doesn't get lost. If we can pass that around. That's only for honors and BCS students in the room. I think that's all our housekeeping. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. I'll just say that, as this last couple years have been playing out on campuses, it's important that this is not on the one hand, what we are facing with the situation nationally and with the current president is a tremendous acceleration of pressure on the basic institutions of a liberal society. It is, in some sense, qualitatively new. That said, the first time I had an idea for this lecture was, in fact, when I was approached by a previous lecturer we had who wanted to speak, who was speaking on questions of Palestinian textile history, and she was like, thank you so much for not giving me a list of banned words that I can't say in my lecture. That was before Trump took power. So the atmosphere in the university, the kind of questioning of the basic commitments to free debate, free argumentation, and free thinking have been, shaking in the last few years, but certainly we're seeing something, I think, more or less unprecedented in American history happening in the present. That said, it's precisely the kind of premise of this evening to think about precedents in American history and how much they may illuminate our present moment, how they differ, etc. So thinking about the analogy of McCarthyism and the present, and where do they match up, where do they illuminate, where do they not help us as a historical analogy, was the task that I was like, I think we should think about together, and I can think of no one more qualified and more brilliant to speak on that subject than American historian Ellen Schrecker. She is the author of including, it's kind of the now foremost history of McCarthyism, Many Are the Crimes, and her whole career has been really devoted to thinking about McCarthyism and its relationship to the universities. She's also published books No Ivory Tower, kind of the standard collection of original primary source documents on McCarthyism. Her most recent book also is The Lost Promise. The most recent is The Right to Learn, Resisting the Right-Wing War on Academic Freedom. She is an extremely accomplished historian. Probably, if you had to pick one person in the world to discuss McCarthyism with, and thus to see what light we can shed on our present moment, it is Professor Schrecker. So let's please give her a big round of applause.
Okay, well, this is thrilling to be in a class. Well, nobody knows.
Do you
The
want to hold
short
it?
people, no, I don't remember.
Okay, yeah.
I just want to speak into it. So I could, this is such a big group. That's great. Okay. It's okay. It's the story of my life. I was always the shortest. Anyhow, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I have been speaking, writing, thinking, living through even McCarthyism for many years. And over the past, I guess, maybe 30 years or so, I've been asked by journalists and colleagues and other people in higher education, well, you know, how does what's happening today, 30 years, what's happening today compares to McCarthyism? And I'm a trained historian, and we're told to really put things into context, provide nuance. You don't give a yes or no answer. You have to sort of say, well, it's complicated. That's usually what you say. And, or else, you know, if you're being grilled by the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, you do not say, it depends on the context, because then you lose your job. But anyhow, I don't indulge in complexity or nuance when I'm talking about McCarthyism and the current situation, because what's happening today is so much worse, just exponentially worse than it's ever been. I'm terrified. You should be even more terrified because you're younger. I think what I want to do today is really compare McCarthyism and the current scene. Okay, you can now see me. And that should help us maybe sort of figure out how we can begin to respond effectively to what's happening today, which is, you know, we use the word unprecedented, and we really have to mean it. It has never happened before when I've been asked to sort of compare it to something in past history of the United States. The closest I can come to is pretty awful, and that's the Civil War. So there are similarities, even though today is really different. Both during and when I'm looking at McCarthyism, I can see these similarities, and sometimes they force themselves upon me when I'm seeing a congressional investigating committee grilling college presidents. I think, oh my God, we really are reliving McCarthyism. But there are other similarities as well. One is that the political repression today and during McCarthyism was pushed by a right-wing network of, as part of a broader campaign that sought to roll back earlier social and political gains in, say, equality or freedom. During the McCarthy period, they were attacking the New Deal. Today, what they're really doing is kind of creating a backlash against the democratic and egalitarian reforms of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the student movement, and that sort of broader democratization of American life that now is under attack. It's both of these episodes of repression have been dominated by opportunistic Republican politicians. I mean, we should name names, as it were, and by professional right-wing pundits at the national level, but also throughout the rest of society. And one of the things about American political repression during McCarthyism and today, and throughout American history, in fact, is that it's not caused by any one single thing or one single group. It's many different strands of people or organizations or groups that want their own agendas, often to preserve power. This is political, and when we're talking about politics, we're talking about power, and let's always keep that in mind. Groups seeking power. At the same time, both during McCarthyism and today, they have also operated with a kind of demonized portrayal of the supposed enemy, whatever is threatening American society today, according to these witch hunters, as it were. And it's a kind of demonized vision of a threat. During the McCarthy period, it was, of course, communist subversion. That somehow there would be people who belonged to the Communist Party who were trying to overthrow the American government, as if that had any reality behind it, which it didn't. And today, of course, it's this group of, what are we, Marxist lunatics, I think is one phrase that our dear leader has been using. But it's a somewhat powerful image, and it was powerful during McCarthyism as well, because it was plausible, because, there were people who were questioning American society in very radical ways that made people who were sort of comfortable and didn't really want to change even more uncomfortable. So we have to realize there is that plausibility, that students did in the 1960s sit in the dean's office and bring their campuses to a close. And students today did put up tents in the middle of the campus at Columbia, UCLA, and a number of other schools. And today, of course, there is, quote unquote, supposedly anti-Semitism, whatever that means. And there are also similarities when we're looking at higher education, and I'm going to be looking mainly at higher education because that's what I've been most engaged in writing about. It's an institution that I've been involved with for over 50 years, so I sort of understand how it operates. And when confronted by powerful political repression, guess what institutions of higher education do? They capitulate. They collaborate. Like the University of California, they send the names of their faculty members who might be, quote unquote, anti-Semitic to the federal government. In other words, they are not resisting in any way, shape, or form. They didn't resist during McCarthyism. That's very important. And they're not resisting enough today. But there are, unfortunately, two main differences that make today's situation so much worse than in the 1950s. And when I'm talking about universities, I want you to realize that universities aren't unique. You know, we know that ABC tried to get Jimmy Kimmel off the air. We know that throughout the Supreme Court has not been on our side and wasn't during the McCarthy period either. We know that the federal government, you know, in other words, this isn't just, what we're seeing isn't just something that universities do. And the most powerful weapon, which I will refer to, I'm sure, again and again, is economic. That people who run afoul of this political repression today are afraid of losing their jobs. Many are losing their jobs already, and that is a very, very powerful way to eliminate criticism of whatever wants to be not criticized. But there are two main differences between today and that make it so much worse than McCarthyism. First, McCarthyism only focused on individual professors. You can sit there, that's just my jacket. It didn't, as it does today, focus on everything that's going on in higher education, in other words. During McCarthyism, all they did was look at whether an individual professor had once been in or near the Communist Party. And that was it. So 100 people were fired. It was very public, and it was enough to cause a major chill throughout higher ed, all education. You know, school teachers were fired, and you couldn't talk in, you know, I have dozens of examples of how people changed what they were teaching, or couldn't use certain words, or couldn't assign a reading by Marx in their classes. And and today's political repression touches everything that goes on in higher education, not just individual professors or teachers' political activities. Now, the other difference why today's situation is so much worse is because higher education is in a much weaker position to resist. And the federal government plays a much larger role within higher education, especially with regard to money, than it did during McCarthyism. It's those two things that make today's attack on higher education so serious. So what I want to do now is look for a little bit at how McCarthyism actually operated within higher education. And it imposed loyalty oaths. There were speakers bans. A lot of this is sort of happening as well today, if you think about it. Speakers bans. There were people who were being dismissed from their jobs. There was a blacklist that was almost 100% effective at its height. I found or interviewed about 100 people who lost their jobs and been blacklisted. I think there were probably at least as many who cases never became public, or just quietly eased out, or as happened during the 1960s, denied tenure. But interestingly enough, the people who were fired mainly during the McCarthy period included people with tenure. I think probably I never went back and looked at my list, but I think most of them did have tenure, but didn't make any difference. But also they were not quote unquote innocent liberals. And they were people who had once been in or near the American Communist movement, but by the time of McCarthyism were no longer really politically active, with one big exception, which was they were resisting McCarthyism. In other words, when they're called before a committee, they take the Fifth Amendment to avoid going to prison. They don't answer the committee's questions. And that's their political activity, and that's what cost them their jobs. Significantly, they were never asked about their teaching or research, but only about their relationship with American communism. And the academic leaders, the college presidents and trustees who were firing these people, knew that. They knew that these unfortunate professors had done nothing wrong, except stand on their constitutional rights. But because of a sort of tradition within higher education of academic freedom, not a very strong tradition, but nonetheless it was there, these administrators had to rationalize what they were doing. They had to say that somehow what these professors who were only refusing to really name names, what the committees, what the FBI, what these organizations were that were trying to identify people as somehow unfit were doing, was just to avoid having to become informants against people who they knew were perfectly innocent, just like they were. But what the academic community did was create this myth, as it were, of what a quote-unquote communist professor was, a robot who would indoctrinate his or her classes, was incapable of unbiased teaching and research, and so simply didn't deserve the protection of academic freedom, just as we now know all these people who are being fired because they may not have said something nice about Charlie Kirk are being told that they are anti-Semitic, right? But there was no evidence whatsoever that these so-called subversives had ever done anything that made them academically unfit to teach. But that's what they were being fired for. And there was no pushback. The most important groups within the academic community, the main Ivy League schools, every group went along with it. And I'll just give you one example that's sort of always stunned me. There's an organization called the American Association of Universities, the AAU. Well, I'd have to walk all over there to write AAU, but now you can do it. And it consisted of the presidents of, at that time, the 37 leading research universities in the United States and Canada. And in the spring of 1953, when McCarthyism was at its peak, and all the committees, McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee, and there was a Senate committee as well, were about to investigate colleges. They'd run out of movie stars and they'd run out of spies within the government. And they're going, they need to find something that'll get them back on the front pages. and so they go to look at Harvard. No difference from today. And these very eminent academics release a statement that they call the obligations and responsibilities of university faculties. And what they're doing in this document is telling faculty members that if you're called up by a congressional committee or other official investigating group, like the FBI, you must cooperate. You must name names. Why? Because it's your professional obligation. Faculty members, after all, are looking for truth. They are looking for, they have an obligation, one, and I quote, to maintain the university's reputation. And they also have this new professional obligation of candor, of telling the truth. So if you're asked about something that might be relevant, like obviously your Communist Party membership 20 years ago is incredibly relevant, then you have to speak out. You have to name names. And that kind of, what should we call, political test for employment created a massive chill. Faculty members engaged in self-censorship. They stopped teaching courses on controversial subjects. One guy who was a very, very eminent literary critic, told me, he was a little ashamed, but he was being very nice to a fellow historian, and he said he remembered when he was teaching about the sort of early 19th century economy, instead of using the word capitalism in his classes, he talked about industrialization. Not quite the same thing. You know, and I can remember I was a college student in the 50s as well. You know, learning, well, I don't have time to get into it, but you know, or it wasn't that I was learning stuff, it was what I wasn't being taught. You know, that's very important to realize, that what doesn't get taught, what doesn't get filmed in Hollywood, what doesn't get, who isn't being hired, there were blacklists in almost every field. Well, McCarthyism did come to an end by the late 50s, mainly because the witch hunters ran out of witches. You know, there were not very many Hollywood left-wing screenwriters left to call up. There were no more spies. They had all been cleaned out. They'd been cleaned out long ago. And there was also other stuff that maybe the American political class needed to deal with, like desegregation. You know, there was this civil rights movement that seemed to be preoccupying many Americans. There was a drive to democratize the universities, to bring in, I mean, there was a school like City University in New York, in the middle, City College, in the middle of Harlem, had several thousand students and probably a dozen black kids. That was it. There was a need for change, and it happened. And that really brought McCarthyism to an end because, you know, there were real problems, no longer the problem of subversive teachers who didn't even exist. But today's assault on the universities is much broader, and it singles out classrooms and curriculum and foreign students. These are things that's just affecting, and you probably can think of some others, libraries, tenure, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, accreditation, departments in fields like women's and African American and LGBTQ studies, even entire institutions. Some of you may have heard about a school in Florida called New College, which was a small experimental liberal public institution, and a wannabe Trump governor named Ron DeSantis simply took over the school and tried to turn it into a sort of roll back 50 years of history and give them that old time nationalism and Christianity and strange curricula with a lot of sports. And Trump really sort of jump-started the current attack on the universities just as he was running for a second term in 2020, when he released an executive order that banned anti-racist training within some federal agencies. And Trump lost the election, but that dog whistle racism that he had begun to push moved to the states, and especially in the South, was picked up by right-wing groups and opportunistic Republican politicians who were introducing dozens of what came to be called gag orders in their states, that initially focused on teaching about the history of racism in American past. Then it evolved into a kind of moral panic about sexuality that targets trans individuals, oh my God, and similarly vulnerable students and programs and departments. And then it became anything that any right-wing politician sort of felt was a little icky. And then once the war in Gaza began after October 7th, 2023, that largely partisan attack by the Republican politicians on the universities merged with an already ongoing right-wing Zionist campaign that weaponized charges of supposed anti-Semitism to eliminate criticism of Israel on American campuses. And this had been going on before October 7th, before the Hamas attack, but it intensified after that. And this was an attack that, by using a very pro-Zionist definition of anti-Semitism created by a group called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. How does ILHA or something like that, IHRA, that equated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And that, as you may recall, resulted late in 2023 with a series of congressional investigations of quote-unquote anti-Semitism on the campuses of some very prestigious schools like Columbia, Penn, and Harvard. And now, with the advent of the Trump regime, everything has escalated. Like McCarthyism, it results in a repression of dissent and free speech that is coming from a variety of sources. Again, like McCarthyism, it's of course the Trump White House, but congressional committees, state legislatures, boards of trustees, private lawsuits by students recruited by pro-Zionist organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, who are claiming that they've been somehow seriously damaged by the anti-Semitism on their campuses. And it results in a direct attack on almost every aspect of higher education, with a focus on, the most elite institutions around at this point, but it's affecting everything. There's attempts by the Trump administration to invoke Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 that is against discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity on the totally illegitimate charges of anti-Semitism that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance have created. But the most deleterious thing that has happened are the cuts in funding for research in particular. Because, and this I just discovered recently when somebody asked me to write an article about the government and how it differs from McCarthyism and how the relationship between the government and universities differs between McCarthyism now. And it's because the government has put so much more money into higher education than it had during McCarthyism, that it is supporting most of the basic research in science, in every branch of science today. That was not the case during McCarthyism. There wasn't that much research. It's grown. Brand new fields have developed. Anyhow, now, what we're seeing today is a very disappointing response by the leadership of the American Academy. Even before Trump returned to the White House, we saw a rush to what many of us call anticipatory obedience. And I've written the URL for a report that was released by an organization I'm active in called the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP, which produces reports on important things that professors and universities should pay attention to. And what anticipatory obedience is that even before Trump entered the White House, even before states began passing these gag rules that said you can't talk about slavery causing the Civil War, even before these really people were no longer supposed to talk about climate change, universities clamped down on those things and sometimes got rid of people if they could, sometimes simply canceled classes at the last minute. Whatever there was, that chill that accompanied McCarthyism had returned to the campuses, and in a much more deleterious way, because it was affecting people who really weren't politically active. You know, these were people who were looking for the cure for cancer, people whose whole lives have been looking at, I just saw a documentary in which I had 15 seconds to speak about Harvard, but anyhow, they were talking to somebody who had been trying to get rid of tuberculosis, which was the leading killer in the world. Who knew that? And that's all gone now. So what we were seeing was a massive crackdown in all kinds of ways. Universities were beginning to clamp down on student protests. Columbia, was the, what should we say, the canary in the coal mine here. And it just flipped over and died, I guess, that poor little canary, but they were, allowing ICE on the campus. They were forcing out tenured professors. They were giving the Trump administration whatever they wanted. Another example was Florida, which is also one of the poster children for states that are most repressive with regard to higher education. The chancellor of the Florida State University system ordered a review of all course content for anti-Semitic or anti-Israeli bias. And here are some of the suspect courses that were canceled. The percussion ensemble, global hip hop, general parasitology, and painting workshop. There you go, guys, bye. But especially after October 7th and the Hamas attack and Israel's subsequent genocidal war in Gaza, administrations were capitulating to demands from all kinds of sources, from politicians, from donors. And donors played a very important role here. Because what had happened, just like the federal government is playing now a much bigger role in universities than it had during McCarthyism, that was what was happening with donors as well. And they're having much more influence over academic institutions than they ever had before. And that's one of the reasons why today's attack on the universities is so much worse than it was during McCarthyism, because the universities are much, much weaker financially. McCarthyism occurred in the 1950s mainly, which was also a period that has been called the golden age of higher education. Why? Because all of a sudden, after World War II, there comes the GI Bill, which expands kids. The government is giving veterans scholarships, money to go to college. Colleges are expanding. There's a baby boom. Your parents or grandparents are beneficiaries of this baby boom. They began to worry there weren't enough colleges, there weren't enough places in college, and there weren't enough faculty members. This was great to be a graduate student in the 50s and 60s. It was amazing. They were throwing money at you, literally. I wasn't going to become a college teacher. I was a real product of the 50s. I was going to teach high school. That was what women did. And you get married, right? Marriage came first and then maybe high school. But they were so desperate for college teachers that they even focused on trying to attract women into college teaching. Amazing. So anyhow, this comes to an end. This moment of sort of unstinting money being thrown at the universities, no more, because there was a backlash against the 60s. Certainly by the right, but ordinary citizens. I mean, nobody had seen students being political before. The 50s generation, my generation, we were the silent generation. Literally, there was no political activity on campus. I was an undergraduate in the 50s and sort of had, mildly leftish views, but there was no organization for me to join. Nothing. I became president of the Radcliffe Democratic Club. That was it. We did, and I joined mainly because that way I could read Harvard boys. So anyhow, the 60s were very different. And there was a massive backlash against it that was picked up by right-wing politicians, some of whom you've probably heard about, like this rather ambitious fellow in California, Ronald Reagan, his name was, who actually ran for governor of California and won with a campaign of opposing the free speech movement at Berkeley. That was all he talked about during his campaign. Won a landslide. So what you're getting is a rolling back of this public support, massive public support for higher education. And state legislatures and even Congress passed a few laws sort of revoking fellowships for students. But the main thing that happened was they withdrew their unstinting support for all of higher education. And that really undermined a lot of the reforms of the 1960s, mostly in the area that that higher education had expanded in, which was in not the sort of big name schools like Berkeley or University of Michigan, but the second tier schools like City University of New York or Eastern Michigan State or something like that, that were really educating or promising to educate the masses of Americans who wanted an education, who wanted to improve their lives, who wanted to rise into a middle-class, white-collar position. And the universities were being defunded just at that moment. When, remember I told you there were a lot of causes, when you're seeing a massive change in the American economy. The 1960s, there was the Vietnam War, you've heard of that? And because the people who were running the American government didn't want to raise taxes, you end up with a lot of borrowing and an inflation that really changed what was happening. And you got for the first time since World War II, when the United States, after the war, completely dominated the world economy. We were the strongest economic power. We made the cars. And then all of a sudden, Germany and Japan, there were Volkswagens, there were Toyotas, and the American economy was undergoing a moment of deindustrialization. The good unionized blue-collar industrial manufacturing jobs that had brought a middle-class standard of living to so many Americans began to go overseas, where they still are. As a result, on top of the political backlash against the 60s, you get a certain amount of austerity. And this is the climate within which American higher education has been struggling since the 1970s. Because how did the universities make up for the lost political state support that they had been relying on. Any idea how they could have?
Raising tuition.
Wow! Yes! It's now, student debt is now $1.8 trillion. It is blighting the lives of an entire generation, no question of it, and casting a pall over all of higher education. It's really horrific. And universities have responded, not just by, although mainly by raising tuition, but then they, you have to attract those students. Who are they? They use foreign students, and foreign students happen to be sort of wealthy upper classes in their own societies, so they're paying full freight. So the sort of problem of access to higher education is becoming much more difficult. They're also diverting money to sort of amenities that would attract students so that they could pay tuition. They're really looking to keep their enrollments up. And they're going out looking for donors who have their own agendas. Mainly, they want to put up fancy buildings that they can put their names on, or football stadiums. Well, I guess you don't have that. But to make everything worse, higher education for the past maybe 50 years has been under a massively funded, very carefully thought out campaign to undermine mainstream academic knowledge that has been conducted by a network of ultra-conservative ideologues and billionaires, like the Koch brothers, you've heard of them, and that has been seeking to move American political culture to the right, and has been very, very successful. And here I will write the name of the book that if I were teaching this course, I'd assign some I'd assign you a chapter 2. It's by a wonderful historian named Nancy McClain, or Democracy in Chains. And I know that people don't read books anymore, but if you did, this is the one you need to read to find out why today is so awful. Okay. Anyhow, it would be so nice to be back in the classroom. I'm enjoying myself. Okay, so anyhow, what these networks of billionaires have been doing is creating a sort of counter-intelligentsia, and all developing think tanks, right-wing think tanks, and spending money on actually millions of dollars on people like Charlie Kirk, and legal campaigns, and of course politicians, and has been subsidizing books, alternative journals, and managed during the so-called culture wars of the 1980s and early 90s to convince a lot of people that universities were dominated by tenured radicals and weak-willed administrators who catered to coddled students of color and other minority groups. But what's most deleterious today, and the biggest handicap that actually affects the university, is the restructuring, or what's really more accurate, the hollowing out of the faculty. That's the group that has the longest and deepest commitment to American higher education, without which no institution of higher learning can actually exist. You can't have a college without a faculty, although maybe in the day we don't talk about it. Anyhow, because what's happened today is that somewhere between 70 and 75% of all the instruction at American colleges and universities is now in the hands of part-time and temporary gig workers who are very poorly paid, and unless they have a union contract or a faculty handbook that guarantees academic freedom, they have no academic freedom whatsoever. They can be fired for any reason, for no reason, and that's it, they're gone. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing it today. Just there, because these people are easy to fire. But it's 70% of the faculty. Do you think they're going to teach the history of the Middle East? We better forget about it. This past summer, for example, the Chancellor of CUNY was called before the House Committee on Education and Workforce, and he was asked about the dreadful anti-Semitism on CUNY's campuses. And he promised to look into it, but it was okay because he had already, before he appeared, he'd already fired 4 temporary workers, 4 adjuncts at Brooklyn College. So, you know, we're even seeing tenured people losing their jobs now. And we should have learned a lesson from McCarthyism, if anything, that those kinds of sacrifices are unnecessary because they don't work. Columbia hasn't gotten all its money back. Harvard hasn't gotten all its money back, and Harvard adopted that International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism even before Trump started taking away its money. Doing this, capitulating like this, only legitimates and strengthens the forces of repression. But I'm not going to leave you too depressed. There is one difference here between the present dire situation and that of McCarthyism. During McCarthyism, there was no resistance. I could not have been asked to give a lecture during this. Nobody could have given a lecture. There were no petitions. There were no demonstrations. Just what one Supreme Court justice called the quote-unquote black silence of fear. Today there's resistance. Many academics, if not yet many academic administrators, are pushing back. They really are. The AAUP, my organization, did nothing during the McCarthy period, nothing, 0. Today, it's standing firm, and with its local chapters, it's even suing the president. And although some universities like Columbia and Penn have capitulated, others are resisting or thinking about it, and we should encourage this. I like to, what lawyers do, of course, the main thing lawyers do is delay. And, that's a legitimate form of resistance if you don't have any stronger tools. So it's very important, throw a little sand in the gears. Be stupid. Incompetence. I mean, they're not going to understand that anyhow. Okay, enough of that. But we do have to be realistic here. We can't depend on the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court was dreadful during McCarthyism. It did not protect the First Amendment right of freedom of speech and association. It just didn't. When it finally got around to it, it didn't. It did, it was okay. But it was a little bit late. And it actually, what's interesting, they did, about 1957, they began to push back against McCarthyism, usually in terms of procedure, that the congressional committees weren't within their jurisdiction. They didn't say they're against free speech. They didn't talk about the substance of political repression, but just the procedure. But at least people were not going to prison anymore. But then there was backlash against that. It was mainly, of course, backlash against Brown versus Board of Education. You have to forget the role of racism in American political repression. You have to remember the role of racism, sorry. You can't forget the role of racism in American political repression. That's really sort of central to this whole constellation of what we're seeing today. But anyhow, what we are seeing today is sprouts of resistance from beginnings of mainstream institutions. Jimmy Kimmel was brought back. That didn't happen during McCarthyism. People really, in the entertainment industry, lost their jobs and were blacklisted, either for the rest of their lives or else for at least a decade. So what we're also seeing is a recognition of the need for solidarity, for eliminating those silos that mean that senior professors with tenure can't talk to their TAs about politics. Well, that's crazy. We all have the same enemy, and what we can see is that resistance works because capitulation doesn't. Now, it may take years. It really may. But if we stick together and coordinate our efforts and take concrete action, I think we will win. And I can give you some examples, but they're very few. And in any event, we have no other option. Thank you. I've taken too much time. You probably want to.
Okay.
I hope you can ask.
Questions. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I want questions.
So raise hands. We have about 20 minutes for questions.
Oh great.
Do you want
to? No, you can do
it
because you know them.
Who do I see? I saw someone. Yeah. Great.
So you mentioned how racism really is part of this. What didn't happen during McCarthyism was it only targeted Black and brown people. Was that because the demographics of the United States was different at the time? Because they only seemed to be targeting white Americans during McCarthyism. At least that's what has been taught to us in history classes since that's happened.
it's very interesting because the South, there was legal segregation in the South. And so there were these HBCUs, and they were the only schools that took in blacklisted professors. But then civil rights movement happened, and if you think about it, where did it begin? Or it accelerated in 1960 with the sit-ins, all by black college students. That sort of jump-started the civil rights movement in a major way. So then, what did the segregationists do? They cracked down on faculty members who supported their students. So you get, and what do? Do they say that they're, supporting their students and, opposing segregation? No, they call them communists. So you get a sort of second act of a racist Red Scare, as it were.
Okay.
So it happened. Can you speak louder?
So you mentioned that the beginning of higher education has to do with the hollowing of faculty and increasing financial dependency on the U.S. government. Do you also think that maybe the people who make up our professors, the demographic, also has something to do with it? I'm from California, and a lot of my neighbors happen to be professors at the UC schools. And I remember when Trump came into the second presidency, a lot of them just retired or went back to China because they knew that in China, their funding's not going to be cut, they're going to be supported. And so when you have increasing numbers of foreign professors who have the ability to just go back to their home country when this administration proves to be unsupported, does that have to do with the beginning of our universities as well? Thank you.
So, I'm sorry, I didn't really get your question though. Do you want to know what happened to foreign professors during McCarthyism?
I think he's asking about contemporary.
Contemporary, yeah.
Is the professoriate, the makeup of the professoriate part of the why they're being targeted?
Yeah. What's interesting, actually, because so much repression, political repression in the United States actually has always been directed against foreigners, the foreign-born. Think of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien, they really were sending people back to France. They thought they were going to spread the French Revolution to the United States. They were scared of that. But McCarthyism, there were attempts to deport people. There weren't very many Chinese, as you know, because they were barred from citizenship. Anyhow, they couldn't come. But the 1950s and 60s was probably the moment in American history with the smallest percentage of foreign-born residents ever. So, that's why there was political repression. There were deportations, political deportations, but they weren't that effective, largely for that reason. But the other reason, which is wonderful, is that in order to deport people, and this is still the case, but the Trump administration doesn't care about laws, I don't think. The problem was that the country of origin had to agree to accept them. And the people who they wanted to get rid of as foreign born were often first generation Jews who had joined the Communist Party. And they had come from Eastern Europe, from Poland, from Russia. And they, the Soviet bloc countries refused to take them. And so they're stuck in the United States. The government harasses them, forces them to sort of check in with the immigration authorities every 6 months or so. Some of them aren't allowed to leave a 100-mile radius of their homes. At one point, the government was considering whether they could deport all these people to Israel. So.
I have one quick question from a student who couldn't be here, if that's okay. She was wondering how students can rationally assess the dangers of protesting in the present environment. Foreign students, native students, how much, I think there is sometimes advice for foreign students, take down all political content off your social media. Is that anticipatory obedience, or is that a good idea in the present circumstances? How do you balance sort of, protecting yourself as a student and, on the other hand, resistance?
I'm scared too. Now I'm lucky because I'm so technologically challenged that I don't know how to I literally don't know how to post on Facebook.
Stay that way.
And, right. And actually, I'm going to hire my granddaughter to help me. She's old enough. She graduated from college. But seriously, you're right to be scared. You really are. But if enough people, if my dream is always that, people become organized, they learn about what's happening. You have to know what's happening. You have to seek out information. You have to, ask questions and then talk about it with people and join people. My dream was that everybody, protest is so mainstream that everybody's sort of going around saying, oh, are you going to the demonstration tonight? Can I join you? That's my dream. And maybe it will happen. That's sort of the way the student movement worked during the 1960s. But we have to work together, and we can't be too scared. I feel like I'm retired, so nobody can fire me. I can't be fired, okay? I own my own home. It's like having rent control. I don't really have to worry that much. I can still get things published. There are all kinds of ways that maybe things will happen to me. Maybe things have already happened and I don't know. I've been told occasionally that people say, oh yes, we were going to plan a conference, but you're too far to the left. Okay, I can live with that. It's annoying. But, you do have to assess the risks. I'm thinking about, or if I were on the social media and I was planning a trip to Europe, say, I would think very carefully about not taking my regular cell phone with me. you know? I'm on some of these blacklists and have been for a while. The Canary Mission one, which is a Zionist one that accuses college professors of quote unquote anti-Semitism because, and I have been pretty careful not to do anything much with regard to Israel because of the school that I taught at, which was a religious Orthodox Jewish institution. And I wasn't really afraid of being fired, but I was afraid that nobody would take my classes. Seriously. And so I just avoided, I figured at least at that, I've been retired for a long time. Anti-Semitism wasn't the boogeyman it is today. I probably would have more problems. I have a few colleagues who are having problems now. But yes, you do have to be careful. But, make sure you're not alone. And give support. Look, if you're not afraid, if you realize you're in a position where, nobody's going to know who you are. Because remember, the face recognition, AI stuff isn't all that good. You can wear funny clothes, or you can throw sand in the gears a little bit. Whatever you can do to protect others is very important.
Hi, I just want to talk more about the media capitulation under this administration, because it seems like a lot of these media agencies are having the same problems of universities, but they're trying to merge and appease the dictator so they can get their merger through.
Yeah.
Also, if you all have TikTok, you should delete it because it's going to the conservative fascists. So just so you know. But I just want to know, how to power through critical thinking skills, because back then you had the same three networks giving one idea of what the news was.
Yeah.
So just how were they able to power through that strong propaganda? Because while we do have more places to get information, we have a lot of billionaires who are really, getting a lot of synergy.
It's very hard, but clearly we have to support that alternative media. And we have to do more. I mean, I feel guilty because, I do have a sort of a name, and I should be writing op-eds every day, and I don't, but I would like to. And, we have to get over our own laziness, I guess, and push ourselves to do what we can. And especially those of us, within universities who do have tenure, who aren't afraid and who know what's happening and can just talk to people, talk to your students, explain how universities are being muzzled. People don't know. When I give it, I've given versions of this talk quite a lot. And, I'm surprised at how many people, when I say, well, about 75% of the faculty are non-tenure track and have no academic freedom, they go, oh! And, you know how much they're paid for a course? It's $3,900 a course. And how many courses can you teach in a semester?
4 and 5.
Yeah. 3 or 4, yeah. They're on food stamps. If they're lucky, they manage to find a wealthy partner. Or who knows what they're doing. I don't, and then what I love is all these people who are talking about intellectual diversity. You know, that colleges are discriminating against conservative faculty members. And you sort of think, yeah, well, if you're a real self-respecting conservative, don't you believe that the most important thing is to make money? Why in the world would you want to become a college professor? You know, I mean, go out and join Goldman Sachs. let's recruit, you know, so, you know, the people on the right aren't always so smart. Or maybe they're smarter than we are. But anyhow, you know, there's a lot of knowledge that is being suppressed because some things are so obvious. You know, we just have to sort of say, this is the way the world works and it's not fair. And we happen to know that the President of the United States doesn't abide by the rules. And to think, apparently, I've been told by a very good source that I cannot reveal, that the trustees of a major Ivy League university believe that the Trump administration is dealing with their problems in good faith. They actually believe it. What universe are they in? I don't know.
We have time for maybe one more question. You see over there. Go ahead.
So I mean, obviously we're touching a lot on the Trump administration and sort of how that's been affecting the current political climate, and how something I'm thinking about a lot is how, you know, Trump won the popular vote and the electoral college. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on how the Democratic Party can sort of come back to the next election, you know, what they kind of have to do in order to unify?
Well, they have to talk about the real world, don't they? You know, and to a certain extent, that's what Trump was doing. You know, he was at least recognizing that people are feeling screwed by the system. And he's willing to destroy the system. The Democrats weren't. I mean, he doesn't care. You know, I think he prints money at home. You know, it's cryptocurrency, but you know, I mean, he's not so dumb. So, you know, I mean, what can I say? You know, now the thing that scares me was the top headline in the Times today, when it's pretty clear that somebody bought out Eric Adams.
Yeah.
You know, just when we thought at least New York City was safe. So, anyhow. So we all have to get out, and I guess. And we have to pay attention to, you know, nitty-gritty politics. That was what the left didn't do in the 60s. And you know, we're suffering from it ever since.
Let's give another thank you to